Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. We have budgeted the next 45 minutes for each of our breakout sessions to give a recap of the discussion. Again, we had 3 groups, each covering one topic. We recognize that you may want to provide views on another topic that you weren't assigned to. If it works for everyone, please reserve those comments and questions maybe until the end so we make sure that we at least get the debriefs covered. With that, I'll hand it over to our subcommittee members.
Okay, so I think our plan is to try to stick to 15 minutes, which is less than 5 minutes amongst the 3 of us, to recap so that we have 30 minutes to have additional discussion, okay? So my topic was the talent drain. And so our group discussed that compensation is in fact a big issue, specifically that today's students must make their major choices early. They typically have little exposure to accounting in K through 12 education, and they do have access to much more data when they're making their decision about majors. A lot of that data is focused on compensation, so that's particularly harmful to trying to attract students. A next thing that we talked about related to the talent drain was that the next generation is very focused on the mission that or the role they play in some larger mission. And firms tend to talk about disclaiming responsibility for things, not our problem, meeting a technical standard, or trying to avoid responsibility sometimes for some things. And there needs to be more focus from the firms on the message of the mission of the profession as a steward of capitalism and capital markets. And that will sell much better to the next generation, talking about auditing in that framework. This historical apprenticeship model in particular doesn't seem to be very appealing. And we do think that the students care a lot about ethics. We've, of course, seen a number of ethical issues come up in the profession. And that's not necessarily a problem, but maybe what would be helpful is to have a response that's sort of sending a stronger message back that, okay, if you have these ethical violations, you can't sign opinions for a certain period of time unless you go through some sort of review or something to kind of send a message about, standing by these ethical standards to people, young people, because it seems like a turnoff the way it's currently positioned. And just a general focus on where accounting fits in the larger ecosystem. There's a lot of times the profession emphasizes, oh, we've got these new great tools with AI and so forth. But the problem with messaging that way is that, if I'm really good at AI, I probably can get a much better paying job. And so talking about the tools as a way of attracting the students maybe misaligns with their interest in the mission. And thinking more broadly about what's the general purpose of accounting and how it might be changing with these tools, a little bit maybe away from focusing on verifying past transactions to more focusing on the business model, the business risks, and so forth, because that seems more interesting and exciting to students. And it's not necessarily that the profession doesn't do those things, it's just not really what's being emphasized as a message. Okay, so another issue or suggestion, I guess, thought our group came up with was that the profession has had very little focus on hiring mid-career people who might be looking to switch careers. One example somebody gave was of this California Advanced Proficiency Program, which I didn't have time to look up, but I can guess that it's something about allowing people to have some credits to transition into accounting and maybe seeking out more of those partnership opportunities with schools and so forth to kind of get more mid-career people interested. Another issue we talked about is sort of better management of work-life balance, and maybe talking about how AI might be a way to achieve this. So again, not focusing on the tool, but really on how is it going to appeal to students as an outcome. Somebody mentioned utilization is actually down, and maybe that's because of some of this remote auditing that's going on. But maybe the firms need to talk about that, because the impression to many people is, too many hours and overworking. Okay, so let me transition into some specific ideas for what the PCOB could do in this role. First is to emphasize the mission role of accounting and auditing more generally, whether that be in all the constituents you talk to, but maybe even more specifically in reaching out to younger students and campaigning earlier into students and sort of getting in front of them. Second idea is to consider spotlighting good accounting. Sometimes the profession or the impression people have when they think about the PCOB is all about enforcement and inspection and negative outcomes, and do you want to go to a profession that has all of this extra oversight, which of course we all know is unfortunately necessary. We can't get rid of it, but maybe there's a way to also emphasize some positives. What are some of the benefits of the good auditing outcomes or of good auditing that you've seen in your inspection process? Even if you don't want to say a specific firm, obviously, but just generally talking about the spotlight of this may get people a little more interested, or specifically good outcomes of whistleblowing, right? What are the benefits that have come? Another idea is to potentially consider monitoring workloads as a professional issue. To consider expanding the role on a voluntary basis, that is, under like an AT standard, an attestation standard. Could there be a role for auditors in determining the reliability of AI, as it obviously relates to their accounting and auditing processes they already do? Maybe there's a way to expand that, and that could get people interested in accounting. Let's see, and then in terms of partnering potentially with the AAA, and to see what other additional opportunities there are for the PCOB to further the profession. And generally sort of an emphasis that I think maybe some people think that accounting and the PCOB, that it's the bad guys, but we're also heroes too, and trying to get that message across. Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Jim now to recap.
Thank you very much, Preeti. Our breakout group on environmental considerations had a very robust discussion, and I thank my colleagues for the significant input, and thanks to the PCOB staff for its assistance. And we were joined by a member of our board, and I thank you for a member of the board, and I thank you for that. We talked about quickly how the impact of the environmental considerations relates to other projects that we're discussing today, and I'll just quickly go over a couple of them. If no CLAR is ultimately implemented, then there'll be a regulatory consideration there. There's possible further considerations around going concern as we think about the environmental disclosures and ultimate regulations that are promulgated. We think that there's certainly an AI component to the data aspect of this, and it even got to harken back to Preeti's discussion to talent. It was pointed out that talent in the organizations now are very interested in the environmental considerations because of their impact and because of the kind of the glow of this work. So it reaches a lot of perspectives. Then the discussion quickly got to the consideration of information that may be required inside versus outside of the financial statements. If you think about the 1% financial metric that's proposed, 1% of a financial statement line item being significant, how do we think about the controls over that? How do we think about consideration of full attestation versus reasonable assurance versus limited assurance? And the discussion indicated that there's a bit of marketplace confusion about this. We then discussed the fact that there are current as well as more dated guidance that already exists out there. The COSO, the Committee on Sponsoring Organizations, just this past March, issued a significant paper called Achieving Effective Internal Controls over Sustainability Reporting. In fact, it was released on March 30th. This is a comprehensive 108-page document, and it's more broad than the environmental matters consideration, but it does provide substantial guidance about the internal control considerations. As I said at the outset, the SEC is as far back as the 70s, but certainly in 2010, issued interpretive guidance on existing SEC disclosure requirements, and the AICPA also has issued guidance. So while we're waiting for certain, obviously, rules and regulations to be issued, there is guidance out there for consideration. As I also stated, the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, just this week issued its general requirements for disclosure of sustainability-related financial information. That's its S1, and S2, climate-related disclosures. And of course, we're all thinking about the timing of the SEC regulations, and that's very important. The agenda, as I said, indicates that it's a Q4 output, but there's a real consideration of how that's going to look. Will it be prospective, and therefore there's an immediate consideration of, where in the financial statements this is required, and what is the expertise required around the attestation limited assurance, whether there's future applicability or phase-ins. This then led to a brief discussion, but an important one, of CAMs, critical audit matters, and whether the significant estimates and assumptions that go into the consideration of environmental disclosures would lead to CAMs, or that for most companies, there is likely to not be a great risk of material misstatement or restatement related to these significant estimates. So not sure which way it would go, but certainly a consideration. And then there was a discussion of the consideration from the, again, attestation or limited assurance perspective, the people who will do this work, whether, it's auditors that have quality control considerations, that have ethics considerations, that have CPE, or if it's non-auditors, what is the training? What is the proficiency? How do we think about it? And it relates to really what's happening today, and that is that rating services are rating various companies on their voluntary disclosures and environmental factors, and it does have an impact in marketplace considerations. There was a brief discussion about the fact that in one instance, a particular company issued bonds and was rated one way, and then issued bonds related to a significantly green eternal project, and there was a 50 basis point difference on that same company, a beneficial difference relative to those considerations. So, those are the things that we discuss very significantly, and of course that led to the consideration of the PCAOB, and I think ultimately it really begins with perhaps some comprehensive research. We know that there is guidance out there. We know we're at some level waiting for the SEC guidance on where in the financial statements or in financial documents will these matters appear, what will be the consideration for attestation, limited assurance, and reasonable assurance. So perhaps the research can begin by cataloging what exists, where the gaps are. Does it lead to guidance being required? Does it lead to ultimately standards, a standard being required? And those are some of the considerations. I would invite my colleagues briefly, if I've missed anything substantial or material, to add them while we transition to Brian. But if I don't hear that, Brian, I'll transition to you. Thank you.
Okay, and certainly at the end, others can chime in as well. So let's turn to artificial intelligence. And we also had a very robust, as you can imagine, dialogue on artificial intelligence, and we were pleased to be joined by a board member and several of the PCB staff, and thanks for the help relative to summarizing some of the perspectives. A number of things, consistent with some of what you heard in the tee-up, I think, but a number of things that we talked about. But I want to start with first, we all thought that it's really important that there be encouragement of the exploration and considerations around the further use of technology, data, and importantly, artificial intelligence. That doesn't mean that it should be done without doing it in a responsible way, but a lot of what we'll talk about after this really goes to the risks and thinking about the implications, and we wouldn't want that to undermine the message about the importance of giving consideration to appropriate use of forms of artificial intelligence as appropriate. So we thought definitionally it's important to start with what are we talking about? Are we talking about machine learning? Are we talking about other forms of artificial intelligence, generative AI, ChatGPT, or other forms? important to really definitionally understand in the conversation what it is we're talking about. Importantly, thinking about what are we doing now versus what's coming in the future. I think it's easy for some to get ahead of themselves relative to the conversation around what one might do or what one currently does. From a risk perspective, we talked about a number of the things that I think myself and various presenters raised, but a lot of time spent on the importance of accurate or appropriate reliable data that's being used, starting with the right place from a technology and data perspective before you introduce machine learning or AI, so that you're understanding what the environment is and the data that you're using is from the beginning, and the reliability of that. Thinking about bias, hallucination, which for those who the example I gave from the New York Times article, I think is a good example of it, but it refers to the generation of outputs that may sound plausible, but are either factually incorrect or unrelated to the given context, and these often emerge from models with inherent biases, lack of real-world understanding, training, data limitations. So in other words, hallucinations means information that it's not explicitly been trained on, leading to unreliable or misleading responses. So we talked a good amount about that. We also talked about, from a management perspective, and I think a lot of this applies to auditors as well, understanding the use within the organization, the policies around it, the governance, considering the costs. Is there a sufficient budget to deal with the risks that are emerging and to deal with and have appropriate plans relative to the use of AI? This is not going to be, just like other forms of technology when introduced, is not going to be inexpensive, and the controls around it are important. Also recognizing that tools that companies may use may begin to introduce AI, and it's important for you to know when, in fact, a third-party tool may begin to actually introduce AI, because those within your organization may begin to use it without you realizing. And then the importance of understanding, is that information going outside of your organization when using those tools. We talked about sufficient basis to be able to begin, as I talked about before, incentives that may occur relative to people wanting to use AI without having a sufficient basis to begin with, to try to leapfrog, but unfortunately that may be risky without starting with the right kind of data and technology to begin with. We talked about the data sets that are being used, so when asking or involving machine learning or AI, making sure that you're using the right sets of data, or when there's ability for AI to use different sets of data, you understand what those different sets of data are, and that they're appropriate to be used. We talked a lot about new fraud risks that could emerge. We also talked about legal implications relative to all sorts of things, including information from a confidentiality perspective or legality perspective of information leaving a company or a firm, and making sure you're appropriately addressing and considering those risks and legal implications. From an auditor perspective, again, many of those apply, so I won't repeat them, but understanding the auditor's own use of any forms of AI, the audit impact, we talked about a lot relative to considering risk assessment, the use of data, the sufficiency of the basis again, and a good amount of discussion around audit committees and the importance of a two-way dialogue around the use of artificial intelligence. So how is the company and how is management described they're using it? How is the auditor using it, and making sure there's a good dialogue between management and the audit committee in that respect. I probably left out sort of some of the proprietary and confidentiality I talked about briefly, but intellectual property as well, thinking about if are you building your own sandbox, or are you using a form of artificial intelligence that actually relies upon or uses and makes available information to others in other organizations, which obviously you'd want to make sure you've controlled appropriately and considered appropriately. So then we talked about what the PCOB, what the committee could do, what the CAG could do, what the PCOB might consider, and there were some pretty strong views, I think, shared among the whole group that something would be appropriate from a PCOB perspective, whether that's guidance or a spotlight that could focus on the risks that are emerging in this space from a management perspective, and then the implications on the audit. So that would include considerations for risk assessment. We talked about whether there should be something in engagement letters. We talked about whether there should be something in representation letters, and certainly whether there should be appropriate responses to those risks in performing the audit. Reminders around professional skepticism when different forms of technology, including AI, are being used. And then we talked about, again, audit committees and their role and the interactions, and also auditor independence in this space as reminders relative to the appropriate role of the auditor and the limitations relative to to performing non-audit services related to technology or data, so that you're not in a position of performing a management function or auditing your own work, or otherwise perhaps doing something that would be contrary to the auditor independence rules. Although we didn't think there were a need for new or different independence rules, it's applying the existing. And then briefly, we talked about how the PCOB could use some of the new technologies, including aspects of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and the like. And I'm sure there's many ways in the inspection program and other aspects of the organizational operations. We didn't spend a ton of time, but certainly it seemed like, again, there are a lot of what we described in terms of the governance and the policies and the considerations could have benefit, and there's risks that need to be addressed from an organizational perspective. And then lastly, we talked about perhaps interaction with other private and governmental agencies. Certainly, the accounting auditing profession is not the first to begin to use AI or other forms of sort of machine learning and again, advanced analytics, those types of things, and really reaching out, understanding learnings from those who may have been or are ahead of the profession relative to the use that they have made. And the PCOB and or SEC may have the ability to have some interactions with some that may benefit them, may be a benefit to them to having those dialogues. So that's a summary. Again, same here. Other members may want to add to what I've described, but that was an attempt to try to summarize the conversation that we had.
We're happy to call on people.
Keisha.
Well, good afternoon. So thank you to all of the subcommittees for their work. And I just want to speak to the talent drain topic, just to share some additional thoughts. When we think about the talent drain, we've been talking about this for a while, so this is not new, but this is time for action. And so I wanted to share just a couple of things for your consideration in terms of benchmarking and maybe just some research. So some of you all may be familiar with the Center for Audit Quality. They did a study that really went directly to the high school and the younger students in community colleges to really ask them about their perceptions about the accounting profession. So when we talk about messaging, that is probably a first place to start to understand what the message needs to be for a different student. The Gen Xers, we've had our glory time. It's time, and now it is time for a different generation. What is motivating them and what they're interested in is very different. So I would speak to you all to think about looking at that research. That their first pass were really focus groups, and they're coming up with some additional research as well, but that's a good starting point. And then they also have some awareness activities. There's a website, Accounting Plus, that is really talking about what is accounting in different ways. And they have a quick quiz that you can go take and really think about different accounting. That's a way that the organization can look at that and start promoting that. And then even in that content, some of your staff people came with different paths in accounting, might be able to tell their story there. So that is one item. Some of you all may be familiar with the auditing, the advisory committee on the auditing profession. They did a fully comprehensive report and did a follow-up report to that. And if you read it, there are some action items that still have not been addressed. So again, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Sometimes those things need to be actioned out. And that is a follow-up report that came out in 2016 that still has some open items in terms of human capital, outreach, and awareness. Next, expand access and use of the PCOB scholarships. The chair, clearly, and all the news releases you've seen, there's some fines, and so that budget is going up for scholarships. So think about, are there ways to expand it to even high schools? And this was a reception conversation last evening. It might take a little bit of finagling, but really to get folks excited earlier and maybe make some commitments when they're coming out of high school to say, if you enroll in one of these accredited institutions, there's some scholarship opportunity for you, because that is, again, helping access, and also high school and maybe two-year colleges. So if you're thinking about expanding in terms of talent, community colleges and two-year colleges are a great place to start looking at individuals that want to come into the profession. And then lastly, my thought is about data access and empirical analysis. For those of us that have been in the profession for a long time, We kind of have anecdotal evidence about what is happening, but I think we need some better empirical evidence. So that's why I appreciate the CAQ's efforts, and it may be a way to maybe partner with NASBA to really get data that we can understand the implications when there are shifts in the access to the profession, whether that's 150, we're now in CPA evolution. We need data to make informed decisions, to make strategic decisions, so entities like the PCAOB can make informed actions to promote the profession and to help the talent drain. Those are my thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Keisha. Lynn?
The, the talent drain issue has been subject of probably 5 major studies in the profession and amongst the academics over the last 5 decades. And the problem always remains the same. And there never seems to be a solution taken that actually addresses the problem. And my interest was piqued in the slide that was put up before we went into the breakout sessions that showed the compensation differential. And we had done a similar analysis and study in 2000 while I was at the SEC, due to the fact the firms were all saying that the independence rules would acerbate this problem. But at that point in time, we compared the salaries not only for other business majors, but also for other professions that students, young kids might be interested in, not just Wall Street, but also science and mathematics, other type of medical, law. And just as the slide showed today, back then, over 2 decades ago, you have these vastly different salary levels that you can get depending upon which professional career path that you choose to take. And ultimately, money has a huge impact on people's behavior. And I think that until the issue is dealt with in terms of the compensation of these young kids and the business model that they're put into, you're never going to solve this problem. It's the compensation gap is just so significantly different that the other professions in the past, and it continues the same today, the students are not dumb. They understand the impact of money. They understand what they get for it. And the best and the brightest are going into engineering. They're going into law. They're going into medical. We are not getting them. And until you can deal with the business model and the compensation schemes, I don't think you'll just continue to have this problem. We studied it, as you mentioned, on ACAP, but nothing's really changed since ACAP with respect to compensation. Nothing's changed really over the last 5 decades to try to narrow the gap in compensation. And as a result, the problem remains the same and will, quite frankly, remain the same going forward. The other point is diversity has been a significant problem for the profession, especially with minorities. It's done a great job on increasing the number of women in the profession, fortunately, but it is still not, for whatever reason, attractive to minorities, and it's got to go where those people are to hire them and improve. And we hear all the time lip service being given to we got to hire diverse and minority groups, but it's just not happening.
Thanks, Lynn. Christine?
Thank you. I wanted to mention just a few points on talent. And Keisha, you said some of this, but I think one of the most important things is that we do a better job at telling our story as accountants. And I don't think our story was really told when I became an accountant, quite frankly, but it didn't need to then. And so we failed to realize that at a certain point in time, we needed to start telling our story, which is an excellent story. Just the sheer variability that exists in being an accountant today, which didn't, again, when I got out of college because there wasn't technology, but just the things you can do, ESG, artificial intelligence, data analytics, without driving them into those sheer disciplines, but making them really understand what a career in accounting is for the long haul. Not just the day you walk in the door, but the day you become an executive in industry or work at the PCAOB or the SEC or become a partner in a public accounting firm. It's that journey that I don't think we do a good job of telling. And it actually gets back to comp to me and what Lynn was talking about, valid points about the entry salary. I will tell you the firms have put significant pressure on that. If you look at the trajectory pre-COVID to now, there has been significant marketplace adjustments by, I think, across the board, the accounting profession. But the part of the story we don't do, it isn't just about the starting salary. I get it, I have 2 kids in their 20s. That's what they look at, but you've got to show them this is what happens when you become a chief accounting officer of a large company. It's lucrative. This is what happens when you become an official at the SEC or the PCAOB. It's a good living. When you become a partner in a public accounting firm, it's a lucrative living. I realize those aren't published figures, but that's part of the story that we haven't told here. So that's just a significant point that I think we've lost sight of. And I will say for our academics in the room, telling our story is really important in beginning accounting and intermediary accounting in college, because talk to these kids in their 20s that I've done, many of them tell me they feel they were weeded out in those classes because of the messaging they got about either the rigor or whatever the messaging was. So I think we need to really think about what we're telling our young people when they're in these classes.
Thank you, Christine. John?
I wanted to talk about AI for a second. As Brian said, it is changing. As a friend of mine who's an AI coder said, anyone who says they're up to date on AI doesn't know what they're talking about. It changes after every 6-hour coding session. So I wanted to, with that in mind, suggest that the PCAOB, in looking at its use in auditing, is, I think, going to have to adopt, or I would suggest that it is a possibility that it adopt a different regulatory framework. It is not something that is going to be knowable and have a standard written, because it's going to be changing way too much in the next however long era. And so what I would suggest is that the PCAOB sort of look at what NIST has done on cybersecurity, which is an ongoing series of best practice guidance, as opposed to a thou shalt not. So because you are going to have to keep up with an ever-changing technology, and that it might be better to have a more flexible way to regulate and suggest best practice to the profession. I don't know what the answers are there, but I think giving yourself that flexibility to deal with new developments as they come up would be, you're not ever going to get to a settled state that you can add, here's a standard that's going to be good for 10 years.
Thanks, John. Dane?
Uh, Thank you. Go back to the brain drain issue for the profession. The other aspect I think that's really important here is, yes, it's the low starting salaries, but it's also that um, it's 150 credit hours to become a CPA, so that's 5 years of schooling. And especially those business students are taking their introduction to finance class and know how to do NPVs. So one more extra year of school, especially in an environment where the cost of education, often increases by 5% or more each year. I think that's also making it harder to attract talent over time. I think that there's opportunity for flexibility there. You have things like I've done the MBA and the CFA and the CPA, but the CFA is like a 3-year program, 3 years of tests, and you cover a lot of the curriculum that you cover in business schools as well. So there's the CPA exam, but you could always figure out ways to inject additional opportunities for people to take tests, um, and not have to, spend 10, 20, $30,000 a year for an additional year of school. And maybe you would also attract more to the profession.
Thank you. Diane?
Thank you. I would also like to talk about the talent issue. Um, I am from the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a very competitive area. And certainly compensation is a key factor. It's not just the dollars. It is what the young people coming out of college can get in terms of a total package. Accounting firms do not offer stock options. They do not offer RSUs. They don't offer a platform of, well, we're going to be the next Google, because these young people want to change the world. And the people that talked about, if we can get the message back on what we are doing for the good of the world. They care about ethics. They want to make their mark. In the Bay Area, I've got 2 kids that live in Silicon Valley, and there's great pressure on them to make their mark really fast. And the idea of waiting 13 years to become a partner, that's a long time for them. So I think the whole compensation package needs to be explored. But I would never want the PCAOB or the state boards of accountancy to sacrifice competency and the protection of the public. So when you ask the question about whom the PCAOB should work with, partner with, I would certainly encourage working with NASBA, the state boards of accountancy, and the AAA to make sure that the relevant knowledge and experience and competency level is not sacrificed in order to bring more people into the profession.
Thanks, Diane. Brady?
I just remember something else our group talked about as something the PCOB needs to put on their horizon is just the tipping point of when do we just simply have enough people to do high quality audits? Is there an estimate of how bad, how long can we let this go before we're in a crisis situation? And I don't know what the answer to that is, but it seems like a question that the PCOB needs to think about.
Jennifer Burns?
Thanks. I agree with all the comments. I just wanted to add that the AICPA has been working with NASBA to begin a program called Experience, Earn, and Learn. It's being piloted this fall. AICPA and NASBA are working together to bridge that gap between the 120 and 150 credit hours, so that extra year of schooling. It would involve working while taking classes so that the individuals can help pay for that extra year of schooling. So that hit on one of the points that somebody else was just talking about.
Susan?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I definitely agree with what Jennifer was saying and a lot of the other comments around here. One of the things I just wanted to point out too is that when we talk about lifestyle, I actually think that the board has done a good job in terms of talking about quality control and saying how, you know, deficiencies rise when we have the staff work X number of hours over certain periods of time. I mean, I think that's a fact, and you have the data on it, and that would be a main way. If you didn't tell kids they had to work 150 hours a week, they don't want to work 150 hours a week. They don't even want to go to an office every day. So I think that that's a really important thing, and that was a good message, and more of that messaging, I think, would be very good. And also just about, you know, when we all talk to people that are younger, you know, we do come from a different place, so we have to think about it, you know, reaching these kids younger that don't have parents that are in these careers, because they're really not familiar with it. And the final thing I would just want to point out is that from a personal standpoint, I mean, I take pride in protecting investors like we do. I think that is what we do, and I think that does resonate with young people. So we probably just kind of need to remember that and really focus on it.
Thanks. Jeff?
Thank you. Just to follow up on some of the comments that were made with respect to accounting students. So I did my own extensive survey in this area earlier this week. I called my nephew. He just graduated from a master's accounting program from a business school at a major public university. So I asked him what he heard from the other students in the business school about pursuing an accounting degree. And his number one issue was the one that several mentioned earlier about the starting salary. He is going to go to work for a large accounting firm as an auditor. His starting salary is $62,000. And he said many of his classmates who are either doing consulting or something related to investment banking, starting salaries are $120,000 to $160,000. And he viewed that as the most significant factor in the other students' decision-making about whether they're going to go into accounting or not. He did mention as a secondary factor, which I think Dane touched on and some others, that the 150 credit hours has some impact on his classmates, as well as preparing for the CPA exam, as well as the process for doing that. You know, some of his fellow students, you know, view the CPA exam as an additional daunting task added on to the additional hours. And with respect, he only had to take one extra semester to get the 150 credits, but that one extra semester, which of course he wasn't working, cost him about $60,000 just in tuition and fees. So there's that cost, and then the opportunity cost, and then just the time and effort of preparing for the CPA exam and filling out all the paperwork that you need to do that. So that's the results of my extensive survey. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I don't have any other 10 cards.
Oh, Melanie.
No.
So I don't have a lot of experience with people who, you know, want to become a CPA, but I have analogous experience with what's going on in the investment advisory universe, where CFPs want to be recognized as a separate profession for financial planning. And they also have a requirement to have X number of hours and, you know, take an exam and, you know, have separate education. And that requires an extra education. So I do recognize the tension with getting the extra education to get the accreditation that you need to get that done. And do also recognize, you know, just the problem with the salaries. Because I can tell you, you know, being in the state, I've been advertising now on the third round to try and get enforcement attorneys to come in to work for a state salary have gotten no applicants. I'm on round 3, it's been posted for 3 days, still have no applicants to experience attorney jobs to do enforcement work, because there are people who just don't want to come in and work for those salaries. And I also have a kid who's senior year aerospace engineering at a college, and they're asking kids, and you guys have talked about this a little bit, they need to know what they want to do before they go into college in most schools now, before, to know. So if you're not going to get somebody who wants to go into accounting, I think you're really looking at, and I went to Maryland, almost 40 years ago, the kids who went into accounting are the kids who didn't cut it when they were in pre-med or pre-law. They ended up going into accounting. Sorry, I'm sure nobody here did that. But, it was kids who didn't know necessarily what they wanted to do when they went in. And especially now, it's so different. You really have to get them before they go in, because otherwise the kids know what they want to do before they go. So there's all these tensions going against what they're going to do. And like you said, they've got the data in their hand. I mean, my kid was at the point of saying, if I go to this school, this is what the starting salaries are for aerospace kids coming out, versus going to this college, this is what the starting salaries are for aerospace kids coming out. I mean, it's that detailed. It's not even just what my major is, it's what what college I'm going to graduate from, what kind of salaries can I expect. So there's that tension, and there's also all the hours, and we hear it. I've been licensing investment advisors for almost 30 years, more than 30 years at this point, and we hear that tension too. So I don't know that there's really a solution, because if you back off on, the requirements for what does it take to become a CPA and take the exam and the extra credits, I think it's going to flip. In a couple of years, the pendulum is going to go in the other direction and say, oh, we're not a profession anymore, and we're not a CPA, and we're not going to get the recognition we want. And the pendulum is going to go in the other direction, because honestly, that's what's going on with the CFPs. Because they wanted to be recognized as their own profession, then they decided it was enough to be recognized as an investment advisor, because they decided, okay, it was too much to go for the profession as a CFP. And now the pendulum's going in the other direction again, and you'll probably hear the ads if you listen to public radio and stuff like that. They're trying to be recognized again as a profession. So it goes back and forth, and their population goes back and forth also between whether they want to do the extra work or not do the extra work to be a profession. So I think that's something that you may want to set aside and decide holistically what's more important about the standards that you want to set for somebody to stay in or not stay in this profession, and what do you need from somebody to have those kinds of credentials and that kind of experience to do the work you want them to do on the other side for the output that you want from what they're doing. And kind of set aside I don't want to do that much work, I don't want to work that hard, or whatever it is, and really worry about what the standards are for the performance you want to get from the people who are doing it.
So just a thought on that 150-hour requirement. As an academic, I question it, because there's not a specific requirement for accounting courses. And so if we're just telling people you need more college credits, I don't know that that's really improving the profession. Now, it turns out a number of people that do the 150 hours do it by getting a master's degree. Some portion do. But because the 150-hour requirement doesn't require specifically additional accounting hours or something specific to improving auditing skills, it seems like a disconnect, right? Either we say, to your point, hey, we need better quality learning and upskilling, and then we specify what kinds of skills or what types of courses. Maybe it's data analytics courses, maybe it's, maybe there's a variety of courses, right? And they may not just be accounting, that's fine. But then we need a requirement that's upskilling, not just let's make them pay more, $60,000 more tuition. I recognize that may not be in my best interest, but I'm just saying I don't think that is meaningful. So if we're going to do extra requirements, then they need to be purposeful and upskilling focused.
Thanks, Preeti. Dane?
Just a quick follow-up on that too. the 150-hour requirement is only something like 20 years old. It was introduced in the late 90s. So most of the folks who here are on this call and who are CPAs probably did not have to go with a 150-hour requirement. My point is, like, yes, education is important, but you can get it through alternative means and prepping for a lot of these standardized tests and so on. It is like, you know, if you have to sit down with a curriculum for a test like a CFA or a CPA, it is like its own form of schooling. It's just, it's more cost effective.
Thanks, Dane. Colleen?
So the 150 hours is a huge discussion point right now with the boards of accountancies, you know, with the profession. I'm sure you're seeing things on that. And there's been a lot of, yes, true, it has been around since the late 90s. It took a long time to get there. And that was part of the advancement of making it a profession. And there was a lot of discussion for those that have been around for a while, even then, about should there be a required master's degree. And there was a lot of political conversation at the time with, because there were a lot of universities that did not have master's programs and were not in favor of requiring a master's. So the discussion was, yes, you should have core accounting classes, you should have core business classes, but it gave the student the flexibility to take other courses. Yes, they could get an MBA, they could get a master's of accountancy, but somebody who started not as an accounting major, maybe they started as a math major or in something completely different, it gave them the opportunity to also make their way into the profession by using the 30 hours after a different degree to get the accounting courses and the business courses. So, and the challenge now of saying, let's go back to 120 is disconcerting because we're in an anti-regulatory environment. And what can easily happen is that, and there are a lot of forces out there that are trying to back off in regulation across the board, not just in accounting, but in everything, and say, it's not a profession anymore. You don't need a license to do this. Let the buyer beware, let the public beware, and that possibly this isn't something that should be licensed. And I think many of us know in the protection of the public interest, just like with the PCAOB, that is the concern, is that the public does look at a CPA, one, to do the audit work, but two, in everything they do, knowing that they are licensed and that they are regulated. So, like I said, there's a lot of discussion, and frankly, there's a lot of discussion of what we're terming alternative pathways. Are there other ways? Jennifer spoke about this ELE program, which is a way to get up to 30 hours post having a bachelor's degree in a very economical fashion, to build out the hours that you're getting, and things that, right now it's going to be a pilot, and it's with firms to say what are things, additional education that students could have, you know, what's missing? What are they missing when they start working for your firm, that if they had more coursework in that, it would be helpful? Things like data analytics or communication skills or, you know, project management or whatever. So there's that one kind of, there's discussions of, should there be more internship hours? Do you turn that 30 hours in some ways into experience, which is where we came from. We used to have more experience requirements and less education. But do know this is a robust conversation happening through all of the stakeholders in the accounting profession now about, are there, you know, maybe the model is wrong. Maybe there are things that we could be doing differently. You know, in the United States, we're heavily reliant on semester credit hours, and that's a definition of education, where many places around the world it's defined differently, apprenticeship models and such. So I just wanted to weigh in and let you know we hear loud and clear, and there are many conversations that I think could be very fruitful as we move forward.
Thank you, Colleen. Okay, so to close it out, Lynn Turner.
Yeah, I'd just like to circle back around on the education thing. When I graduated in 76, business was substantially different than what it is today. At that point in time, we didn't even have the Apple II out, the first Apple. In fact, at that point in time, IBM's desktop wasn't out. We didn't have derivatives of the nature, the vast nature that we have today. Our business operations have gone global. Supply chains are dramatically different. Marketing methods have advanced substantially. And yet 4 years is what was required in 76. And to say that we go back and think you could educate a young person enough to have a baseline education to go out and practice as an auditor in these businesses today with the same 4 years, you're fooling yourself. It ain't going to happen. And in fact, in the Colonial Bank case, the largest bank that fell during the financial crisis, the question was raised to the senior on the job with respect to some lending activity and his ability to analyze some of the issues. And his response was, that's above my pay grade. Yet it's the type of thing that you'd expect someone to be able to do. And so if we're talking about cutting back to 4 years, given what has transpired with the business community, you just are not going to be able to get a person out there that's got the skill sets necessary to do the job. And this thing's going to be a train wreck. So I think trying to blame it on additional years is almost ridiculous, because look at the attorneys. They go for an additional 3 years and they face an extremely tough test, just as CPAs do, if not tougher. The medical profession, they have to go an additional 3 years of college, then a couple years of additional work inside the hospital, and then in residency, and then maybe a fellowship before they get out and make substantial money. So you can't, it works, it attracts, those professions attract those kids. They know the compensation will be there, and it's not going to be 13 years to get to that number. And so trying to blame this on just simply, we don't want to incur the cost to go one more year in college, I find to be really a disingenuous cop-out on what the real problem is in this situation. And for those kids who do go through and get that additional education, it does distinguish their talent from the kids who came out with just 4 years of education. They've got additional information, and that is valuable to the employer. And the employers need to compensate them for that.
Good, thank you, Lynn. And again, thank you to the Emerging Issues and Auditing Subcommittee for handling that session. That brings us to our next and last agenda item, which is a discussion on interim reviews. And Dominika Taraskevich will lead our discussion.
Thanks, Barb. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm part of the project team working on the project to consider updates to the auditor's responsibilities for reviews of interim financial information, or as I'll refer to it, interim reviews. PCAOB standards require auditors to comply with AS 4105 in connection with performing an interim review. The SEC requires issuers to engage an independent accountant, typically the issuer's auditor, to review interim financial information before the issuer files such information in its quarterly reports. Therefore, auditors generally perform interim reviews for each quarter of the issuer's fiscal year. An interim review differs significantly from an audit, which we will discuss in more detail. We distributed a briefing paper providing some relevant background information, including questions seeking your views on the various aspects of interim reviews. So for the purposes of today's discussion, we've categorized the questions in the briefing paper into 3 areas. We'll first talk about the scope and objective of an interim review, the interim review procedures, and finally, evaluating and communicating the results of the interim review. In the interest of time, and to allow everybody to provide comment on all the topics, I'll provide a brief overview of each section and then open up the floor for discussion at the end. We are interested in hearing your views and your experiences regarding these topics. We're also interested in your views on academic research papers, external reports, or other information sources relevant to evaluating potential economic impacts of modifying the standard on interim reviews. So with that, let's move to the first topic, which is the objective and scope of the interim review. So the objective of an interim review under 4105 is to provide the auditor with a basis for communicating whether the auditor is aware of any material modifications that should be made to the interim financial information in order for it to conform to the generally accepted accounting principles. As I previously mentioned, the objective of an interim review differs significantly from that of an audit conducted in accordance with our standards. An interim review does not provide a basis for expressing an opinion about whether the financial statements are presented fairly in all material respects in conformity with the applicable financial reporting framework. In an audit, PCAOB standards require the auditor to plan and perform the audit to obtain reasonable assurance about whether the financial statements are free from material misstatement. So I put some of the relevant questions from the briefing paper on the slide to drive the discussion. The next section that I wanted to just touch on are the actual interim review procedures. So an interim review consists primarily of analytical procedures and inquiries of persons responsible for financial and accounting matters. The specific analytical procedures, inquiries, and other review procedures performed are tailored to the engagement based on the auditor's knowledge of the company's business and its internal controls. AS 4105 requires the auditor to apply analytical procedures to the interim financial information to identify and provide a basis for inquiry about the relationships and individual items that appear to be unusual or that may indicate a material misstatement. The standard includes some required analytical procedures as well as examples of other analytical procedures that the auditor may perform. Additionally, the auditor is required to make inquiries of those who have responsibility for financial and accounting matters and perform other review procedures, such as, for example, reading the available minutes of meetings of shareholders. AS 4105 also provides a list of required inquiries and related procedures. Certain auditing procedures may also be performed concurrently with a review of interim financial information. So this could, for example, include procedures related to a significant or unusual transaction occurring during the interim review period. So that brings us to the second set of questions, which are on the next 3 slides, and I'll just provide an example of those. So we would like to get your views on, for example, should there be procedures other than inquiry and analytical procedures to be required as part of an interim review? What types of procedures? In your experience, how has technology and the use of technology-assisted tools influence how interim reviews are performed? And what type of audit procedures are commonly performed concurrently with an interim review? So those are some of the other the topics we'd like to explore as well. So finally, the last area I just wanted to touch on before we open up the discussion is evaluating and communicating the results of an interim review. So as I mentioned earlier, an interim review is not designed to obtain reasonable assurance that the interim financial information is free from material misstatement. However, based on the review procedures performed, the auditor may become aware of likely misstatements. Under AS 4105, misstatements identified by the auditor or brought to the auditor's attention, including inadequate disclosures, should be evaluated individually and in the aggregate to determine whether material modifications should be made to the interim financial information for it to conform with generally accepted accounting principles. If the auditor becomes aware of certain matters, the auditor is required to communicate them to management, and if not appropriately addressed, then to the audit committee. With respect to reporting, AS 4105 does not require the auditor to issue a review report. Nonetheless, the standard provides the form for the review report, along with examples and provisions in the event that the report needs to be modified. The SEC also does not require the company to include a review report with the quarterly filings unless the company states in its filing that the interim financial information has been reviewed by the independent public accountant. So with that, I do want to open up the floor for any thoughts, experiences, views you have on any of these topics. Feel free to address any and all questions or just provide your general views. I know it's riveting.
Go ahead, Christine. Okay. Oh, John, over you first. Okay. So just as far as some overall thoughts, I think the interim standards today, to me, are fit for purpose in the sense that you do have the ability to do audit-like procedures, for example, depending on the facts and circumstances. And in fact, that's done today. In an interim review, if you were to have a significant, unusual, or complicated transaction, some major business combination, for example, restructuring charge, whatever the transaction might be, there might be situations where you do audit-like procedures. So in that sense, I do think the standards contemplate that. And the nature, the timing, the extent of those procedures are determined based on the facts and circumstances. One approach might be, even in lieu of standard setting, thinking about whether additional guidance could be developed and issued today about when the auditor would do procedures, audit-like procedures in the interim period, and what are the types of transactions, what are the nature and extent of those procedures without doing frankly, an amendment or a rewrite of the rule.
Thank you. John, did you want to go?
Yeah, I not no specifics on this, but just as a lawyer that, excuse me, that's involved often or around companies that are doing interim reviews in, I guess I would say, challenging circumstances sometimes, they make a big difference. And we shouldn't do anything that lessens what's going on here, because I really think that they provide an important market discipline, and the quality of the product that comes out is much better having interim reviews. I mean, just having the accountants there puts pressure on the issuers, the preparers, to, I'm going to say, get it right now and not put it off till the audit later. And it surfaces a lot of issues and frankly gets them resolved at the quarterly stage rather than being put off to the annual period.
Thanks, John. Steve?
So I agree with what Christine was saying, and to build on that in terms of guidance, the PCOB may want to look at the AICPA. The AICPA has interim review standard as well, UC 930, but I'm actually looking right now at ARC 90, which is the review guidance, paragraphs 5, 42, and A74 talk about, give some guidance, and specifically some application guidance about when you would do more than inquiries and analytics. There is a perception out there amongst some practitioners that a review is only inquiry and analytics, as opposed to, usually the word is ordinarily inquiry and analytics. And sometimes it is appropriate to get to what's termed in the AICPA literature that limited assurance, that you need to do more than just inquiry and analytics. And it gives examples of substantive tests of details, external confirmation. So to offer that up as some guidance that's already in practice that might be helpful in the public company space. And then also to build into the concept of the review report, which is kind of skipping to the end in terms of there. And I would be interested to know from the investors and others around the room what they anticipate, when they know that these financials or this is being subject to an interim review, what does that mean to them, particularly when there is no report that is attached to that? Do they think that this is a mini audit? Do they have any idea that what's there? I have witnessed a professional one time saying to me that, this was a while ago, fortunately, that said that, oh, do we really care because we're not issuing a report? That was not definitely the right mindset in terms of there. And so I was happy to see on there the question of, should a report be issued? And I don't know the background of how that came into being, that there is no report that's issued. I'm sure there's a logic to that. I understand it's not required. But I was excited to see that question on here as something that they may help with the expectation gap between with what investors are looking at and expecting and what they perceive is going on with that review.
Thanks, Steve. Brian?
Thanks. So on this one, I guess what I would say, I do think the existing standard has stood the test of time. I agree with Christine's comment, John's comment. I agree with a lot of the comments that have been made. So I certainly wouldn't do anything that undermines what we're doing today in this space. Not that there was a suggestion that there would be, but a couple things. One, I would add that even when we're performing incremental audit-like procedures, which we often do in connection with an interim review for a variety of reasons, those may not be complete the same way they would relative to what needs to be done at the time of the audit. So in other words, we may do just enough at interim to get comfortable there's not something else we need to go chase, but we may not conclude those procedures in such a way that they would be suitable relative to compliance with your auditing standards, which is fine under today's standards. That's what you would want. Actually, you want just enough to, or at least enough to satisfy the requirements from an interim review perspective and be comfortable there's not something to chase, if you will, given the timing of interim reviews. But I think the discipline that we see today is good around it. There probably are some good or better practices that could be worked into an updated standard if you're looking to modernize the standard. But I don't think there's fundamentally big issues to address in drafting a new standard. On the report issue, and it really goes to your first question as well, an expectation gap. I don't hear this over the years. I've not heard this is an area where there's an existing expectation gap. And I do fear that you could actually create one if not careful relative to requiring the report. Certainly, I think the reports we do issue, and we do issue some in this space, I think that's fine. And I know other firms issue reports. Usually it's at the request of management, but it's a limited number of those reports today. If you were to create a requirement in any changes to the report, you'd want to be careful not to create an expectation gap. My view is that you probably could go ahead and create that kind of a requirement, but I don't know what problem we're solving by doing that. I don't understand there'd be a problem we're solving by doing that. I don't understand there'd be a problem today relative to the lack of there being a report on the interim reviews. So those would be my observations.
Thanks, Brian. Jim Hunt?
Yeah, thanks very much. I would agree with John and with Steve and I think with Brian. but don't be afraid to put a little bit of onus on audit committee chairman. I'm an audit committee chairman, and the quarterly review is very important to me. You know, I'm pretty experienced, so I feel like I know what to ask. But if I was less experienced and there was a little bit of guidance out there for me or for an audit committee chairman, you know, from the PCAOB, as you're doing with audit committees today, here's some things you may want to consider when reviewing the results of an interim review. I think that would be helpful. I think doing a report changes the tenor of it from the firm's perspective and adds significantly to the cost. And I'm not sure that the cost benefit would really be there. And so I would like to take a look at that. But I think to make the audit committee, and particularly the chairman of the audit committee, I guess, maybe the whole audit committee, you know, kind of have an expectation of the job it should do with regard to interim financial information, interim financial statements. I think John White made the comment that, you know, having auditors in there on an interim basis, it does discipline us it does discipline the management team. It does discipline the systems. And to some extent, it adds a degree of discipline to the whole process. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Lynn Turner?
Yeah, let me respond to the question about why we do it the way we do it. When the commission originally adopted the requirement for a review for the first time, it was in the late 70s. And they applied the requirement to only about the 200 largest public companies at the time. The commission had put out a proposal and literally got just 3 comments in support and overwhelming opposition. And in fact, Chairman Ray Garrett at the time was reluctant to do it. He went to his chief accountant, Sandy Burton, and said, how can we adopt this? And Sandy says, because it's the right thing to do, and they did it, but limited to those 200 largest companies. And then around 1989, the SEC came across some enforcement cases in which the auditors were, as part of their interim reviews, were finding large adjustments that needed to be made on an interim basis, but they didn't address them until it got down to year-end audit. And if it was material to the quarter but not to the year-end audit, then they didn't deal with it. And so the SEC commenced 2 enforcement action and gave the profession the chance to address it or face an SEC rule. And so they updated the standard to require auditors, if they find a problem in an interim review, then to take whatever additional steps are necessary at that point in time to resolve that issue. I think very consistent with what Christine talked about. And then a decade later, when we got down to the 2000 time period, and you had Enron and WorldCom, had a lot of companies where there were real questions about the quality of their interim reports. And as a result, we did rulemaking as part of our earnings management initiative at the SEC. And we put the requirement out there, proposed it for all companies, and that you'd have to complete your review before the company could file the report. But a number of the firms in the profession, led by 1 or 2 of the big 4, came back and told us that if we required the reports to be filed, they'd oppose our proposal. And as a result, we thought it most important to get the reviews done and expanded to all the public companies. And so in the final rule, we said you had to complete the review. You didn't have to file the report, but all companies would have to have this review done. And that's quite simply why a report wasn't required. And so both in the 70s, the 90s, 2000, changes were made that advanced it, but it was significantly impacted by what was politically reality at the time. Not that it was the right answer, the best answer, but it certainly advanced the things from where we were 5 decades ago. And our problem since then is you can look, and there's been a number of SEC enforcement cases where companies filed the interim reviews and didn't have the completed review report. And part of the time that has been management at the being the real problem that happened. At other times, though, auditors were aware of the fact that they weren't done with the review and hadn't issued a report, and that was problematic. I have discussed this with a number of audit committees. Usually, if you got a CPA on the audit committee, there's someone there that's knowledgeable. If you don't, then you very well may have an audit committee that isn't familiar with the requirements. I've surveyed and talked to a number of audit committee chairs at times, and the chair couldn't tell me if the auditor ever gave him a review report or not. And investors, quite frankly, just don't know because they never see it. And so that's where we're at today. I think that the requirements that are there today, and the fact that if you run across a problem, you got to resolve it. You just can't wait. That is the key and integral part with the whole thing, as well as the fact that you got to have the review done by the time you file. It would be good to take the next step and require communication between the auditor and the audit committee. I'm sure the audit firms kind of heard this from Brian a little bit. They're going to be concerned about litigation. And I think plaintiff lawyers are hesitant to go after the Qs. They haven't done that often. They have and were successful in the Lehman case, but not that often that investors and their attorneys want to take on an interim review because of the nature of the review. And so I think that is understood, but we ought to at least be making sure that there's communication between the audit committee and the auditors, that the review was done before the filing was filed. And I would have no problem if you turned around and said, rather than having nothing, because as Brian said, most of the time a report isn't even put together, at least provide the review report to the audit committee before the filing is made.
Thank you, Lynn. Diane? Yes, thank you. I have 3 comments on your question. The first one was whether or not there is an expectation gap among the various stakeholders. And I wouldn't be surprised if there is, because the terminology that we use is sometimes a little confusing. So if we have interim field work, that is interim audit field work. That refers to the audit. And here we have an interim review. And if people speak of auditors doing a review, well, audit implies they're doing an audit. And at the same time, the auditors are doing the review concurrently while they're doing their interim audit work. So why would anyone be confused? So I think some of these issues of our own making, I mean, if we said a quarterly review, might be better. But I think we have to be careful by using terms like auditors do the review, because then they think, oh, I've got the auditor hat on, and they're also doing their interim audit work. So that's one point. The second one, in my experience as an audit committee chair on what happens and what we discuss with our auditors during our quarterly meeting for a 10Q with them, they are doing much more than analytical and inquiry, because they are addressing the CAMs every period. because you can't wait till the end of the year. And so we have identified the CAMs in every audit. So in looking at these interim reviews, it doesn't really specifically address CAMs, but I think I find that we do it every time. We do a deep dive. We have very robust conversations with our auditors during these meetings about it could be impairment issues, it could be fair value issues, it could be CECL memos. I review the CECL memo on a quarterly basis as an audit committee chair. And we discuss the CECL memo in detail, and every audit committee member reads the CECL memo. And it's a very, very robust discussion. So that's my experience. And then the third point I wanted to make was on initial interim reviews, if you are the successor auditor. And the information and the steps that are required to obtain sufficient knowledge, I don't know that it is quite enough, because for that initial period, it's tough for the initial auditor to really gain all the information. I think here I would add information about the CAMs to do further, obtain information about the CAMs and whether or not any assumptions have changed during that period that would affect these complex, subjective areas. Someone mentioned that only 4% of frauds are uncovered by the auditors. Well, a very small percentage of that number are discovered by initial auditors, because the ones that have been working for years know the company, they know the culture, they know the management, they know about the tone at the top. They have all this wealth of information that you don't really get by speaking to the predecessor auditor. You have to get it as, some of it, you have to get it as you go. So I think in terms of what is prescribed for the initial interim review, they might need a little bit more. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. Sandy?
Yeah, thanks, Lynn, for the review of the history, because I couldn't remember all of it. But, you know, I think that my view is that investors, they may have heard that the quarterly statements are reviewed, but they don't really know what that means. It sort of harkens me back to the current discussion about limited versus reasonable assurance. And all the auditors talk about it like investors are going to know what that means, other than limited is going to be less. But what does that actually mean, right? Personally, I think that it's a great illustration of the lack of communication, and that investors don't understand what auditors are actually doing each quarterly review. And so to me, the communication would actually be quite useful. I completely agree with the comments that have been made with respect to discipline and basically auditing significant adjustments during the quarterly review. I mean, I as a former corporate controller wanted to make sure those transactions were audited, because I didn't want an adjustment later, because investors don't expect an adjustment later. And I think that while these are important distinctions for auditors, investors are making decisions all throughout the year, and they don't really want those numbers to change by a lot. They don't want a big surprise. So to me, I think when Dominica said, is this an interesting topic? Or isn't this an interesting topic? I'm like, yes, this is quite an interesting topic, right, for investors, because they are very interested in knowing what's actually done, because I don't think they're well educated on that. I mean, I find that investors don't understand the degree to which the information that precedes the audit report in an SEC document has been audited, reviewed, read, or the like, right? A lot of them think it's the same, but others know it isn't, and they don't want it to be audited because they don't want management. They don't want the auditor to quell what management's going to say, right? They want them to speak more freely. So for me, I think it is an important topic, and I think that communication is essential to it. It gets back to the overall issue that we have as investors in that we're buying a service that we don't know is going on, right? We're paying for this and we don't know what's going on. So to me, somebody said we don't know what problem we're solving. I think the problem is the person who's paying for it doesn't know what's going on. To me, that's what we're trying to do.
Thanks, Sandy. John White?
As I was thinking about this a little bit, there is a bit of a trade-off here, because if you do require a report, being realistic about it, it's going to take longer. There's going to be more documentation. There will also be more rigor, I believe. But the trade-off is that it'll be your 10Q will be filed later, and investors will get information later. So I'm just being realistic about it. So you're making a little bit of a trade-off of when information gets out there versus having the additional rigor and documentation that will come from filing a report.
A couple of follow-up thoughts. So first thought, to build on what John just said, is perhaps the solution is, and maybe you already do this, in the inspection process to be checking occasionally for whether the process has been followed and completed on time. Is there documentation of it? And we don't then need to maybe file a report, but we can still then therefore encourage the auditors that aren't doing it, or the clients that aren't doing it, to make some progress on that. So that's a suggestion. The second suggestion is to look at some analysis of quarterly restatements to understand what might be the driving cause of them. That might suggest where interim procedures may require improvement. And a third thought, a general thought, I haven't done that type of analysis on Q restatements, but I'm just hypothesizing that risk assessment focus is probably the place to spend more time on, if anywhere, that if there's a better connection between risk assessment and interim procedures, that might be a good return on the money. And then my last thought as I was reading these interim reports is that although I understand Sandy's point that still there's an expectation gap, I don't disagree with that. What I did like about reviewing it was that there was at least some effort to distinguish what interim procedures are versus a full audit. And wouldn't it be nice to have that in the space of E for environment, where we could use a similar type model to explain the difference between limited assurance and reasonable assurance and a full audit? Thanks.
Josh?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I'll just add on a little bit, I think, to Christine and others' comments earlier, that, I mean, I think from a foundation perspective, 4105, I think has generally been fit for purpose kind of standard. I guess one of the questions you raised I thought was interesting was really asking about what are the advantages and disadvantages of a more risk-based approach. And it seemed like you guys maybe were asking about, is that not only where the auditor might do procedures, the areas that might be covered in a review, but maybe the depth of the procedures that might be done. And I think on the depth of procedures, you've heard, I guess there are a number of situations where auditors do procedures concurrent with the interim review. But I guess in the areas of where, like, in incorporating the element of risk, I do think it probably goes without saying, but I guess as you think about the objectives of 4105 in terms of the objectives of the review and how the auditor, the procedures that 4105 prescribes in terms of bringing the knowledge of the audit, of the previous year's audit, right, the significant financial reporting matters that were subject to the audit, which would include matters like CAMs, matters that were subject to CAMs, areas where there were misstatements in the past. Those are, obviously things the auditor brings to bear when they're performing the procedures in the interim review. So it is a, a fairly risk-based kind of model today. And so not sure if you were looking for some, additional thoughts on additional areas of risk, but thought at least it was helpful to point out that the procedures today are very focused on areas of importance, building off of not only your previous audit experience, but also the expectation that you've gotten up to speed with what are some of the key drivers in the business and in the environment when you're executing them as well.
Thank you, Josh. Sandy?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. I wanted to push back a little bit on the thought that the release of the information would be later because of the issuance of a review report. To me, that means that the procedures really weren't done like they should have been done, right? Because all we're doing is issuing the report on it. And when I was corporate controller, we actually got a review report from the auditor. It only went to the audit committee. But I would hate to think that if we had put that in the document, it would have had more that needed to be done with it, because I would think giving it to the audit committee should have sufficed to have everything done. So I don't necessarily see it that way, and I think that investors, if it was a day or so longer, they probably would be willing to wait for that.
Thanks, Sandy. Lynn?
Yeah, I'd like to echo Sandy's comments. When we did the rulemaking at the SEC, we made it clear that you had to have the review completed by the time the quarterly, the 10Q was filed, and you had to have completed it in accordance with the established professional standards. So if you're saying that it's going to take you longer if you had to issue a report, that is very concerning to me, because that is indicative of the fact it can only be caused if you are doing some additional procedures that you believe had to be done to comply with the standards, and you hadn't got the work done and documented as required by the standards at the time you did the filing. So if they've done the interim review in accordance with the rules and the regulations and the standards, there's no reason it should take longer. If they haven't complied with the standards, then I do see the basis for John's comment that it will take longer, but that would indicate that Preeti is absolutely right. George Boddick should be taking a look at this during the course of inspections, because it tells me that perhaps we still have the problem of people filing the 10Q before the interim review is done and wrapped up and documented.
Thanks, Lynn. Steve Morrison?
Well, I think Lynn and the previous respondent kind of stole my thunder here. I was going to have a similar comment on I could envision the report requirement adding literally a few hours for the administrative process of putting out a piece of paper. But I agree with the other comments that your review, whether you're issuing a report or not, a review is a review. And I could see some concern over the time compression and everything, but we learned to deal with CCAMs. We've learned to deal with various communications that have to happen in advance. So I think it's something that would certainly be adaptable. And I want to thank the investors and the audit committee personnel for speaking up, because that perspective to me as an auditor is very helpful. And something that was also being said around here about possibly giving reports just to the audit committee and so forth. There's already communication requirements. There's already communications often already happen. So I think that if those are insufficient, that would be good feedback. But in terms of the report, I was really mainly thinking of for the investing public to see that, whether that would be helpful per se in terms of contextualizing what a review is and what a review is not. And lastly, one of the things that I think that a couple of people touched on it is what is a review and what's going to be expected? Is this a mini audit? Is this just an audit on a quarterly basis, or is this only inquiries and analytics? Is it something in between? And I think that's the struggle that any standard setter has, not to make light of it, but it's anybody has. Once you have the audit level of service, which is that reasonable, that highest level of assurance, to go to something less, where do you draw the lines? And then you add on the extra complexity of, since you've done an audit, other than those initial audit times, you know what you know. And which is beneficial, I think, because as the gentleman was saying over here, you're rolling forward that risk analysis. You've informed your interim procedures based on what you've already known. So it kind of creates this, in my mind, the interim reviews tend to be somewhat of a unique animal. And that if there is going to be, and I think that's where the benefit of communicating what a review is and what it isn't, if the marketplace pushes back and says, hey, we want more, that could be a further discussion for future standard setting. But for now, what I'm kind of hearing is it seems like there's probably a lot of diversity of opinion on what the review is or isn't, and maybe even some confusion that might be out there in the marketplace. But I'm making a very broad and overarching statement to go to what you were saying, Brian, before about maybe not this. I don't hear a lot of people pushing back on this. This is not something that I think keeps a lot of people up at night. But when it does come to something, listening to the people around this table as an interesting thought process, which was why I was excited. And I lead a boring life, so that's when I say when I was excited about this review question. I do lead a boring life, and it wasn't the top thing on my list, but I thought, wow, that's an interesting question, and I really appreciate Lynn giving us the history lesson, because that I think was very helpful context.
Thanks. Yeah, it certainly wasn't top on my list either. So maybe just a few things. One, so the PCOE can and does inspect interim reviews. And in fact, there's a public report from a couple of years ago, I think it is now, where for at least the larger firms, they inspected some number of interim reviews specifically. I think for our firm it was 6, and I think it might have been close to that for some of the other large firms. And so you can read about the results of those from a profession perspective. It, in fact, probably should in the context of thinking about the questions the PCB is teeing up here. But I don't recall in looking at it again recently anything that was so significant that I thought I should raise it here relative to. I mean, clearly we didn't receive any comments at our particular firm, but there wasn't anything in that report that I thought was worthy of raising for discussion again here. And just to be sure, I don't, we issue some interim review reports today, and we don't perform different procedures where we issue the report. Our policies for performing that work, the robustness of that work, it's the same relative to whether or not we issue the report. I agree it's probably relatively minor relative to time frame, and you would have the draft report ready to go, and when you're done, you would deliver that report. I don't think it adds significant time. And most importantly, I would want to respond to say that the work is indeed completed before filings are made, and the communications around that are clear with audit committees and management relative to when we are complete. And the few times that you see maybe enforcement or something unique where a company has filed a report where they didn't even have a signed report, and that even relates to an annual audit, or circumstances where an interim review wasn't complete, it's relatively rare, but those are generally former clients after that, and those are circumstances that obviously we take very seriously and have obligations around, as do companies, and they certainly get the attention of the SEC and PCOB in the limited circumstances where that has occurred. But that's thankfully a very rare occurrence that I'm aware of.
Thanks, Brian. John White?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Brian was saying, I don't think the problem is that companies are filing their 10Qs before they have the sign-off on the report. There was the SEC enforcement did a sweep back in September of 2018, in which they actually charged 5 companies for doing exactly that, filing their report without having the sign-off. And everybody knows. I mean, they established the rule. 5 companies paid a penalty, and so on. And people do not do that, at least from my experience today, because enforcement's made it very clear
that that's a violation of the securities laws and, they're going to come after you. So as I see it, you're often waiting around for the auditors to complete the review before you file. But I don't think the problem is that people are filing without a review, which is in effect what Brian said, just a more long-winded way of saying it. With 5 SEC enforcement actions, if you want to go look at them in September of 18.
Thank you. Jim Hunt?
Thank you, and not to pile on a robust discussion, but I take the point about investors, and I think we have to distinguish between investor protection here and investor education, perhaps, because I take the point about okay, what is in an interim review, et cetera, et cetera. I don't believe you'd be more satisfied after reading an interim review report versus really understanding and reading. You understand the financials, but reading the financials, because as Brian knows, in the few that he's issued, they don't really say too much. And again, as an audit committee chairman, I personally get it, and I'm sure others do too. You get a great deal out of sitting down with the audit partner, members of the team, and during the interim, and having reviewed the queue and knowing what's in the queue, and having discussed with management what's in the queue, and having discussed with management what's going on in the quarter. You get a great deal out of that. And so I feel that's the level of investor protection. But I do take the point about investor education. So perhaps, what the board needs to consider is that difference. I'm not convinced at any level that adding a report to the interim financial statements does anything further for investor protection. But I think I do respect the need for continuing investor education. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Sandy?
Can I just make one comment there? Because I think that certainly communication is education, right? So investors don't necessarily know that anything has been done. So you are communicating to them that a review has been done. Whether the review report is sufficiently communicative is a different and also very important issue, right? Is the issue we have faced with audit reports. And in the investor advisory group meeting, we talked about whether CAMs were sufficiently communicative, not only for education, but for investor protection, right? So I don't think they can necessarily be parsed from one to the other. But right now, they don't have anything. So that's my concern, is that it's so, if it's not perfect, we shouldn't do anything, right? And I don't think that that's the way that the direction we should be heading. So I just want to put that out there, because investors are generally smart. They can ask what the review procedures entailed if they wanted to. They don't generally talk to the auditors, as we talked about in CAMS, but I'm just concerned by that, because investors need more information about what's being done, not less.
I don't see any other hands up, but I think that was lots of great food for thought. Any other comments before we move to our wrap up? Okay, well, I don't have much of a wrap up. I just want to thank you all, especially for those of you who took your chances with some of the travel challenges this week to get here. And thank you for the contributions you've made. And a special thank you again to the Emerging Issues and Audit Subcommittee. I do want to, before I let everyone go, do take a moment to thank my colleagues who worked very hard to put these meetings together. Jessica Watts, Danny Verbeck, Akiko Upchurch, our Office of External Affairs, particularly Todd Cranford and Brian Goodnaw, and Lucia Caramba and Jay Watkins for their assistance during the meeting. Thank you again. We look forward to seeing you. I believe it's November 2nd, which sounds like a long time away, but I'm sure it'll go very quickly. Safe travels, and I hope you all enjoy your summer. And thank you to the public who's tuned in online.